Today we're going to continue our study of the 21st century by talking about the Iraq War, which started in 2003. We briefly talked about last class, and we're going to talk about other major events of the 2000s decade. So the Iraq War. What made the U.S. view Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, as an evil dictator? He was an evil dictator. He gave the Iraqi people no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion whatsoever. He enforced these laws through violent tyranny. Okay? He was later charged, officially, with the murder of 148 people, torture of women and children, and the illegal arrest of 399 others. Now, that is just what he was officially charged with. So that is what was proven in court without a shadow of a doubt. He also committed genocide against Kurdish Muslims in North Iraq and Marsh Arabs in South Iraq. Thousands of people were killed by Saddam Hussein. He was an absolute Islamofascist tyrant, and he ruled his people with an iron fist. Now, in addition to Saddam Hussein's evil actions, the U.S. also believed that he had control of what were known as WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and we believed that he was harboring al-Qaeda members in Iraq. So the U.S. responded in March of 2003 with the help of Great Britain and a few other countries by invading Iraq as a part of what we called Operation Iraqi Freedom. So if you look at that map right there, that was the invasion route. Now our goals were four. We had four main goals. Number one was to capture and remove Saddam Hussein. Number two was to replace his regime with a better government, preferably a democracy in Iraq. Third was to target al-Qaeda forces hiding there, and number four was to obtain Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So Saddam Hussein, when the American forces invaded Iraq in March of 2003, he ran and he went into hiding while his army attempted to fight off the Americans. Now, he was found later that year. He was found in December of 2003, hiding literally in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse, near a farmhouse near the town of Tikrit, Iraq, where he grew up. This is what he looked like after he was caught. His beard was completely grown out. In order to make sure that it was him, we had his dental records, made sure that it was for sure him, made him shave, and then we saw, yes, that is definitely Saddam Hussein. All right, so there you see the soldier who dragged Saddam Hussein out of his hole, and he was then under American custody. So he was interrogated. He was put on trial at a U.S. Army base for all of his crimes against humanity, against his own people. And then in December of 2006, he was executed by hanging. So the response of most Iraqi citizens in April of 2003, when U.S. forces entered Baghdad and toppled the government of Saddam Hussein, was very positive. Most Iraqi citizens were very joyful that America was there. They took to the streets in joy and thanksgiving that their tyrant was finally gone. And many Iraqis tore down statues of Saddam Hussein and greeted the American troops with tearful gratitude for freeing them from their oppressive dictator. They said, now we will finally be free. We no longer have to fear this tyrant, this oppressor who had beaten us down for so long. He is now finally gone. So Bush declared that we had, quote, removed an ally of al-Qaeda. So not only was this seen as a victory for the Iraqi people, but it was also seen as a victory in the war on terror. Now, on May 1st, 2003, President Bush landed in a plane on the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and he gave a speech to hundreds of American soldiers that had just completed this mission in Iraq to recapture the city of Baghdad. Now, obviously, the war was not over at this point, and Bush knew that. He knew that we still had a lot of work to do. We still had to find the WMDs. We still had to fight more al-Qaeda and other forces in Iraq. We still needed to establish a government, but the first big step had taken place. And then he gave a speech on this ship. Now, the USS Abraham Lincoln had just completed a mission in Iraq, and while Bush was speaking, there was a huge banner behind him. He didn't even know about this, but there was a huge banner behind him that read "Mission Accomplished," and it was referring to that particular operation, that individual operation that the USS Abraham Lincoln ship had just completed. But whenever people just saw this video or this picture here, a lot of people thought that Bush was implying that our mission was accomplished in Iraq, like we had won the war already, which obviously was not true. Of course, this was not Bush's intention with the speech. Like I said, he didn't even know that that banner was going to be there, but it made him look stupid. It made him look unintelligent to those who saw the picture without the context. Okay, so that's why it's important to always get the context and not just jump to conclusions when we hear news stories. So for 8 years in Iraq, the people that the U.S. forces fought against were a variety of anti-American Muslim groups that we called insurgents. Insurgents. So these groups included Al Qaeda, included several other groups who either had supported Hussein. You had a lot of Sunni Muslims. Hussein was a Sunni Muslim, and he treated the Sunni Muslims in his country better because that's the type of person he was. But he brutally oppressed the Shia Muslims as well as the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. And so you had a lot of Sunni Muslims joining the insurgents because they now felt that their ally Hussein was gone. People who wanted Iraq to be an Islamic state instead of a democracy were also in the insurgents, or simply people who did not want the U.S. involved in the affairs of Iraq. Okay, you had one guy named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was one of the leaders of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed could not have been more different from Osama bin Laden as far as like personality. All right, Osama bin Laden was educated and very an analytical thinker. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was all brawn. Okay, he was a guy who had tattoos all over his body, and whenever he converted to Islam, he removed those tattoos with a Bowie knife. All right, so that's the kind of person who was leading a lot of the forces in Iraq against the U.S. A lot of the insurgents. Now, similar to Vietnam, the enemy knew the terrain better, and also we really didn't understand why they were fighting. Okay, they fought for reasons we did not fully understand. Now, things that caused public support for the war to decline in America from 2004 to 2011 was first the fact that the war lasted so long. Okay, the Iraq War lasted a long time. Yes, we accomplished our original mission very quickly, very effectively, but then it just started to drag on, and more Americans were dying. Okay? American soldiers were dying by the dozens, especially in places like Fallujah. It cost a lot of money. Like I said, $3 trillion were spent on this war. And Americans weren't really seeing any positive results of the invasion. Okay? A lot of Iraqis were seeing positive results, but we here in America, I mean, a lot of us didn't really care so much about that. We ourselves were not seeing positive results. It was just costing a lot of money and some American lives. Also, the U.S. failed to find any weapons of mass destruction. And this was one of our goals from the beginning, remember, was to find weapons of mass destruction. Now, what probably happened is that Saddam Hussein destroyed his weapons of mass destruction or gave them to another country or sold them to another country, something like that. Because as I said, we know that he used to have weapons of mass destruction. He used them in the 1980s. But we did not find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, no matter how hard we looked for them. Okay? So when that happened, a lot of people kind of forgot all of the other reasons why we invaded Iraq and said, oh, well, if there's no WMDs, then we shouldn't have invaded Iraq at all, kind of missing the big picture there. So in 2007, President Bush faced a dilemma. Okay, the war was not going well. We hadn't had any major victories since 2003, and he faced a choice: either withdraw all forces from Iraq and let it fall to the insurgents but save American lives, or send more troops into Iraq, all right, and defeat these people once and for all in that area. And Bush decided that he could not remove troops because then all of the Americans who had died, he said, would have died in vain. He said we were going to increase our troop presence in Iraq by 20,000 soldiers. Okay? He said having more soldiers in Iraq is going to allow us to take control over a lot of urban areas. He also appointed a new leader, David Petraeus, who had the philosophy that not only do we need more soldiers, but we need to win hearts and minds, he said. We need to meet with the people of the towns we liberate. We don't need to just liberate them. We need to meet with them, shake their hands, tell them about our way of life, and show them that we care about them. Okay, and this was incredibly effective. Having those more soldiers in Iraq and this new strategy by Petraeus, it allowed us to take over Baghdad and a lot of other urban areas that had been held by the insurgents for years. And this resulted ultimately in a decrease in fighting, a decrease in overall deaths by the end of the summer of 2007. So the surge worked very, very well. And a lot of people think that it probably should have been employed sooner. So this was a very successful mission in Iraq. Now, the state of the U.S. economy in the 2000s. At the end of the 1990s, going into the year 2000, as we've talked about, the economy was very strong, and it remained relatively strong throughout most of the 2000s. It just had one major problem, and that was inflation. You have prices, especially like gas prices, becoming very high in the 2000s. $450 for gas was not entirely uncommon. You see those prices right there. And the economy was not stagnant, though. Salaries increased at the rate of inflation, so the inflation wasn't felt quite as much, but it still wasn't a good thing. So the early to mid 2000s are seen as a time of relative economic prosperity, not the booming prosperity that we saw in the 80s and 90s and like 1950s or 20s, but it was a relatively prosperous time. So in 2004, George W. Bush, he ran for re-election against Democrat John Kerry, and the results were very decisive. President Bush won re-election. Aside from Kerry being a decorated Vietnam veteran, he won 3 Purple Hearts. He was not seen as a very strong candidate, and additionally, Bush was still very popular, fairly popular, because of his response to 9/11, because of Saddam Hussein's capture, and because the economy was still going fairly well. So while George W. Bush's approval ratings were fairly high at the end of his first term, things took a turn for the worse in his second term, starting in 2005. And that started with the huge crisis of Hurricane Katrina. This was an absolute catastrophe, a Category 5 hurricane that demolished New Orleans and the coast of Mississippi. It caused massive flooding, death, and destruction. So many people died from this one hurricane. Now, Bush's advisors advised him not to visit New Orleans immediately following the storm because there was a lot of violent aftermath going on in this chaotic and dangerous environment of post-Katrina New Orleans. You had a lot of looters. It was pretty much like the Wild West down there, okay? You had very little law enforcement. People were doing all sorts of terrible things, murdering, raping, robbing stores, and it just wasn't safe for someone like the president to be there. So his advisor said, you can't go there, okay? You're going to get shot. And so Bush said, all right, but I at least want to see New Orleans, to at least see what my people are going through so I can sympathize with them and respond to this in the best way I know how. So this resulted in a picture being taken of Bush looking out the window of his plane on the flood zone. You see that picture right there of him looking at the flood zone of Katrina. Now, a lot of people didn't know the story behind it and just took this picture out of context, and they saw this as a sign that their president didn't really care about them, didn't care about them enough to land his plane and come visit them, that he didn't really want to get involved in their tragedies. They just wanted to fly above them and be above them and kind of look at them from on high. Now, of course, that was not accurate at all, but, perception is sometimes more important than reality, and that was the perception. The perception was that Bush didn't really care as much, and he was just kind of out of touch and didn't understand how bad Hurricane Katrina was. Some people, amazingly, even accused Bush of being a racist, which could not have been further from the truth. He appointed the first ever black Secretary of State with Colin Powell. He appointed the first black female Secretary of State his next term with Condoleezza Rice, also the first black National Security Advisor. He did a tremendous amount of good in Africa, giving AIDS relief and giving malaria and cancer relief. He did not have a racist bone in his body. But that didn't stop people like Kanye West from calling him a racist. Nonetheless, Bush's popularity began to go down very quickly after Katrina because of the perception. He did visit New Orleans shortly afterward to help, but kind of the publicity damage had been done by that point. There were several other things that caused President Bush to lose popularity in his second term. First off, the American people began to get frustrated that Osama bin Laden still had not been found yet, and also that the Iraq War was still going on. We still hadn't found any WMD. We had not established a democracy there yet, and people were still dying. And in addition to that, the national debt was increasing dramatically to the point that by the time Bush left office in 2009, the debt was nearly $9 trillion. Now, if you know what the debt is now, you know that is not a very large number compared to what the debt is now. Okay, but that was double. $9 trillion is double what the debt was when Bush took office. Okay, so doubling the national debt is certainly not a good thing. And then to make things even worse, in 2008, the housing bubble burst. Okay, now this is very complicated. We can get into more details in a discussion in class if you want. But what this basically means is that the housing market, which is a huge portion of the economy, the entire industry of home building, completely collapsed. Okay? And this resulted in millions of people having to foreclose on their homes, losing their homes, and also losing their jobs over the next 4 years. And this is what started what we called the Great Recession. The Great Recession of 2008 to 2012. The economy was absolutely horrible during this time. Now, as you know, right now the economy is doing well. We finally recovered from the Great Recession, but for about 4 years, it was really bad. It was really, really bad. Unemployment was nearly 10% at one point, which is the highest it had been since the Great Depression, and the economy was really as bad as it had been, or worse than it has ever been since the Great Depression. Obviously, the Depression was worse, but this was the worst it had been since then. And going into the election of 2008, the economy was the number one issue on voters' minds. Okay, so the sudden recession in 2008 is something that we only fully recovered from about a year ago. All right, and as you see, it just plummeted Bush's approval ratings. Okay, his approval ratings, which had once been over 90%, fell to about 30%, which is rock bottom. Now, an American public that had previously been very pleased with our heroic, fearless leader, President Bush, became very dissatisfied with him by the end of his presidency because of all the difficult and bad things we had been through. So Bush left office with historically low approval ratings, even though he had kept America safe for 7.5 years after 9/11, which is no small accomplishment whatsoever. But by the end of George W. Bush's presidency, there was kind of a sense of malaise and desperation and discouragement in the country due to the war on terror and due to the economic collapse. And people wanted change. Okay, people wanted something different from President Bush, something different from what we had over the past 8 years. And so Americans looked to elect someone who was very different from Bush and who promised to bring change to America, and that person was Barack Obama. Okay, so he was elected in 2008. Next class, we will talk about President Obama's time in office and then finish up talking about the last few years with President Trump.